Welcome to RCR TV and the U2U Connect show. I'm Limor Schafman, the show host. It's my pleasure to be with you here today. Today we're going to take a look at our networks, our wireless networks. How can we extract the most revenue out of them? Are we looking at them from the right way, from a revenue perspective? Are we being innovative enough in terms of how we're maximizing their usage for the kind of things we need to do in today's M2M and in the future M2M world? To help us look at this, we have Lemco's Chief Strategy and Revenue Officer, Norman Fekrat. Norman, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, Limor. Thank you very much. Glad to be here. Appreciate it.
So, Norman, you've been a consultant in the telecom space for quite a while. You've been involved with Lemco now for a period of time. Tell us from your perspective a little bit about your background and what Lemco is doing, and then we'll sort of launch into what your view is of what's happening here in this space.
Sure, I appreciate it. So my background is I've been mostly a consultant to the telecommunications industry for about 25 years. I spent 19 years or so at Anderson Consulting and Accenture, and also then 2 years at IBM. And in both of those rather large consulting firms, I was always providing guidance and business and technology advice and consultative advice to the large telecom operators in mostly North America. So I've got this big company, consulting background to the industry, and now, as of the past, 6 months or so, I've joined a very innovative, mature wireless technology startup that's very much focused on, driving some economic changes and technology benefits for our mobile networks today.
Great, thank you. So with that in mind, to our viewers who are joining us, so what we're going to be talking about now is our networks. They are basically data-based in the sense that since 2009, data has actually surpassed voice in terms of what our networks are carrying. And data is key to our communications, not only today, but also increasingly into the future, particularly because of the M2M industry, or with the M2M industry and its explosive future that we see happening now, just the beginning, and what we anticipate will happen in the future. And so as we're looking at this, though, the way that these networks are looking at their costs, the way they're looking at their revenue, the way the analysts are also making their assessments about these companies seems to perhaps not be quite in line with where the future is going, and really not allowing for us to actually maximize the revenue and take a real look at the costs, and a real hard look at the costs, a realistic look at the costs, so they can be addressed. So Norman, from your perspective, what do you see happening in the industry with regard to how the carriers and the analysts are taking a look at network costs and revenues?
Yeah, Limor, I think it's a very relevant topic today. And when I kind of look at it, I put my consulting hat on, and I look to see the behavior in the industry and how the carriers are kind of reacting to the marketplace pressures today, with data now surpassing voice. I really look at the financial analysts in the industry that follow telecommunications. And when you look at the economic measurements that the financial analyst community is kind of driving the industry towards, they're really back in the telecom 1.0 kind of voice-centric economic measurements. And those are things that we're all commonly used to hearing: number of subscribers, average revenue per user, cost per gross add of a customer, and then churn. And when you kind of look at where we are today, where we are a telecom, a telecom 2.0 data dominant industry, where voice is, quite frankly, an application on data now, those really aren't the right correct financial measurements to be analyzing and measuring the success of carriers' economics. And when you really look at it, it should, the industry should start driving new economic measurements. The analysts should start driving new economic measurements in the industry to be things more like cost per gigabyte, maybe profit per gigabyte, even things like profit per gigabyte per megahertz pop by content type or data service. And when they start to really measure the industry, which I personally believe those are the right economic measurements for our industry, and I think it will eventually change the behavior in the industry so that the carriers start measuring themselves on these economic metrics to then, therefore, do more optimization and lower their cost of delivering data services to then, therefore, and lower the cost to the end subscribers like you and I.
So one of the things that came to mind actually as they're describing the different models is that by doing this, it sounds like it might also help the carriers to no longer be just pipes, which is what they're combating all the time, but to actually even think more creatively in terms of what they're offering to the end consumer is, whether it's enterprise or an individual. And it might, in fact, just change their offerings, their applications, their entire view on their own business. Is my understanding that correctly?
That's right. I think the first thing, how I would react to that is, there's two sides of the equation, right? There's the cost side of the equation, and then there's the revenue side of the equation. And the revenue side of the equation is what a carrier would get as long as they're providing incremental value in addition to the access and pipes that you mentioned. The number one thing I think that our industry needs to do is to become the lowest cost per gigabit provider in the industry. And when I go talk to a lot of my clients and customers in the carrier space, especially in the mobility space, I highly encourage and recommend for them to become the lowest cost per gigabit provider in the world. And to get to that, you need to start looking at new comparisons. You shouldn't just compare one tier 1 mobile operator to another tier 1 mobile operator. I think they really need to compare their cost structures to the cost structures of wireline and also to the cost structures of some of these over-the-top applications. And if they don't really significantly evolve their cost structures to get to the lowest cost per bit provider, I think it's going to be an uphill battle on their delaying the margin erosion problem that our mobile industry has today.
So if they're going to be doing that, I mean, explain to me a little bit more about then if they're making these comparisons to those kinds of lines, they're going to just say, hey, listen, we naturally have more infrastructure costs because we have to put up these towers, we have to pull up these cell sites. We have more data going over, we have more traffic going over our systems now than these wired lines. I mean, I can see different arguments, whether or not they're correct, I can see different arguments. So explain to me how can we get these carriers to think differently and to actually start looking beyond just their narrow scope in terms of their comparisons of who their competition is, and to look at these others so that they can go for the lowest price. And also, if they are going to be lowest price, are you saying that their margin is going to grow because their and revenue, the cost to us, the consumers, is going to maintain the same? Or if you're saying that the cost to us, the consumer, is going to reduce, then how are they in fact going to realize the revenue which they've come to expect and which, frankly, Wall Street has come to expect from these carriers?
Right. And that's a, well, you have several questions wrapped up in there, Limor, so let me try to tackle each one at a time. And let's maybe put Spectrum, on hold for a little bit. We'll come back and talk about the Spectrum challenge out there. But when you look at the behavior, and I'll focus on North America right now because every geography is a little bit different. But when you look at North America and you see the behavior of what's happening is a lot of the carriers in North America seem to be just increasing the price on the end consumer. Now, of course, they are trying to do innovation and take advantage of technologies, but I think they're doing it too slow. And in the result, when you see the impacts to consumers out there, the price just keeps going up and up. We had unlimited data plans, which are really no longer in existence. We then had tiered pricing plans, which I think were quite frankly a band-aid on a problem. And those tiered pricing plans, I think, have irritated all the consumers because they have to track how much they use, and nobody wants to track how much they use. Then the industry's evolved to family plan pricing, which is all in a way to really just increase the prices to the end consumer without driving the right technology innovation to reduce the cost per gigabit of handling the data traffic that everybody wants. And I think that is something that I think as you and I and everyone listening as consumers would probably agree with, that our mobile wireless plans just seem to be going up and up and up. So I think that's one point on this. Now, to then address the cost structures of this, I think there's things that carriers can really learn about from other industries on the wireless side. I'll take two examples here. I'll take the IT or technology side of an industry and see how what the IT industry has learned and how those principles should be applied to the wireless network. You look at things like virtualization. You look at things like cloud-based technologies. You look at things like software as a service. These are common, proven IT technologies at scale in large global enterprises and other companies that are cloud-based companies that ride on top of all the internet. But for some reason, the wireless infrastructure network providers have seemed to ignore all of these proven technologies that are out there today. So I kind of asked myself, as an innovator, as a software technology provider to the mobile industry, those are those principles and proven technologies that I think if you take these and you deploy them into the mobile network, you can get a lot of benefits. The other example I will look at is on the wireline network side. Right, the wireline networks, this is DSL, cable modems, they have learned a lot, and they've had to reduce their cost structures down significantly, and they've taken advantage of things like content delivery networks, like caching, and these are things that the mobile network operators have not taken advantage of today. So I kind of look at it and I say, hey, there's proven things out there from IT with virtualization, software as a service, there's things with wireline infrastructures, content delivery networks, and caching, that if you took advantage of these technologies, proven technologies, and just applied them into the mobile network, into the wireless mobile network space, you would significantly be able to reduce your cost per gigabit. And then, to your question is, you have to reduce your cost per gigabit significantly so that their margin will therefore increase. And then you can start to layer on incremental applications that are value added to the end consumer, and then the consumer will feel more comfortable paying more for an incremental value added solution.
So it sounds like you're saying that the carriers are going to sort of need to shift their business model, not only in terms of how they're managing their infrastructure, but also in terms of their offering to the consumer. So now let's go though to the spectrum question, because that's something that's on everyone's mind, both from the cable industry, the telecom industry, wireless industry, and everyone's arguing for this spectrum because they keep on claiming we want more, we need more, and then cable is trying to hold on as much as possible. And over the top is becoming increasingly a popular mechanism on the one side, from the cable industry side, in terms of how to deliver content that is not necessarily within a fixed structure. And on the other side, we see that the wireless carriers are offloading onto smaller wireless Wi-Fi networks. And yet, is that the best way for the networks and the carriers, for everyone to manage this overabundance of content that then again is just beginning, because video is just beginning to take off, and frankly it's not going to be just video in the future. So what do you think is going to be happening given the needs and the demands that our content creation is going to put on the networks going forward?
Yeah, so spectrum, right? Everybody's talking about spectrum. I need more spectrum. All the carriers are, lobbying and all over the FCC. All spectrum needs to be reallocated to the mobile operators. And, on one side of the equation, I agree with, spectrum is needed, and more spectrum is needed in order to handle all the significant data growth and mobile video that's really just beginning. Right? It's really just beginning on the growth of and demand on mobile data and mobile video. So I agree that more spectrum is needed for carriers and it needs to be allocated. But what you do with the spectrum is more important once you have it. I don't think getting the spectrum and kind of holding on to it is something that I necessarily would agree with. And what I see, when you kind of take a step back and you look at the behavior of the industry, all the tier 1 carriers are getting the majority of the spectrum, and there's an auction coming up to reallocate TV broadcast spectrum to the carrier spectrum with the reverse auction and everything. But what are the carriers really doing with their spectrum? Are they rolling it out to rural locations? I mean, I don't see LTE being rolled out anywhere rurally right now. I think that's a problem. I think carriers
they keep on claiming that it's too expensive for them. Every time a rural area, and I know this from having spoken to several towns, every time a rural area makes a request, large companies go in, they say, yes, 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 we're going to do it, we're going to do it, we're going to do it, and then the more they think about the economics, they just leave them hanging high and dry, and all of a sudden they've got these small rural communities have nothing.
Yeah, so let's talk about that for a second, right? So why isn't why isn't LTE being rolled out in the rural areas, right? It's pretty simple. It's the economics associated with it. The technologies are there, right? I mean, if LTE can work in a metropolitan area, there's no reason why it can't work in a rural area. The problem is that the cost structures that the carriers have from a cost per gigabit perspective to support that technology in a rural area, it is cost prohibitive for them to roll out LTE in those areas, and they will lose money on those cell sites. Now, what's the problem with that? The problem is that they've not driven enough innovation into their networks in order to support that service at a cost-effective standpoint where they can make profit on it. So what the mobile network operators have done is they've created a whole other internet for mobility. If you look at the point from the cell tower all the way to the internet, right? It's a proprietary network that the network equipment providers have created, and they put 4G on top of 3G on top of 2G. And when you do that, the OpEx cost keeps increasing up and up and up. And that's what the carriers have today. They've got a 4G overlay on a 3G on top of a 2G, and their cost per gigabit just keeps going up and up and up. And that's why they can't, really, support LTE in these rural, more difficult locations. And that's my whole point, is that proprietary network, that mobile packet core, the last proprietary bastion of network technologies that pretty much exists on the planet, needs to be disrupted. It needs to be, innovation needs to be driven into that. That's more software defined, virtualization, self-organizing networks, and then reduce so that the costs and CDN and caching, so the costs are realized, and LTE can then therefore be supported in those rural areas. So I think that's it's probably a little bit of a long answer to answer the question, but I think that really gets to the fundamental principle of why LTE is not supported in those areas and why carriers can't do it profitably today.
And then I think it brings us the question of the end consumer. So we have the farmers out there in the field that actually are increasingly used and using wireless technology, whether they have tablets in their when they're going through and they're reaping the wheat, just so they can see how far they've gone, how much has gone through their system. I mean, a lot of the different automotive vehicles that are used by farmers today are using usually wireless, networks and systems and M2M systems actually, in order to track both what the vehicles themselves are doing, but also the kinds of stuff that is being processed through, and that's how farmers are using it. I'm sure that they're also frankly, from an education perspective, we have rural communities that are not able to get the kind of access to these wireless infrastructures that they need in order to make sure that their children are as educated as possible, and that all the small businesses in those areas are as connected and making use of these kind of technologies as possible. So from your understanding, from your perspective, what is the consumer seeing in terms of what they're not seeing and what they could see if these carriers thought about their business situations just a little bit differently?
Yeah, so there's an unbelievable set of applications that could be rolled out if there was a mobile broadband network that had universal coverage across North America. Quite frankly, today, there's a lot of geographies and a lot of areas that don't have mobile broadband. And if they do want to try to get mobile broadband there, is it really extremely expensive. So, the history here, the Universal Service Funds, the Broadband Fund, there's always been, funding made available for universal access, especially for mobility now, and that's the focus. But, the carriers are, they seem to be disassociating themselves with those parts of the geographies. And when you look at even at the wireline business in rural areas, I mean, quite frankly, Frontier, CenturyLink, and these wireline rural roll-ups exist because of that. And I think quite quickly, right behind that, you're going to see a bunch of rural wireless roll-ups out there because the carriers, the tier 1 carriers, will not make the investment, and their cost structures are too high to drive a profitable, mobile broadband service in those geographies. And just as another example, a little more is, not to pick on the carriers too much because, the service they provide is, quite frankly, very good, as long as there's not a national disaster or anything when all the networks go down. But when you look at the spectrum, it's not just rural areas that, the carriers are not taking advantage of, but when you look in building, carriers seem to be speaking out of both sides of their mouth, right? They say, hey, I want spectrum and I need more and more spectrum. But on the other side, they're offloading everything they possibly can, especially in building, to unlicensed Wi-Fi spectrum. So I don't get it. You want spectrum and you need it because you want to offer that quality service, but then, in building, you're just going to drop everything off to an unlicensed spectrum side. So from a macro level, that doesn't make any sense at all, right? Because you're saying, I want the spectrum and need it, but when in reality, I can't support mobile data cost effectively, so I'm going to try to get all the data tonnage off of my network as much as possible, throw it on a Wi-Fi and internet basis to help me support, to basically lower my cost structures to support the service. So that's a whole other, dilemma that's going on out there that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But that's the behavior that we're seeing in the industry, right? And the economics are driving that behavior.
Right. Right. So let's talk about solutions. We've talked about all different kinds of issues that are out there. What do you see as some of the solutions that are possible? And you've hinted at them, and I think they're actually quite creative. So talk to us about that.
Yeah, so this is, it's a big problem in our industry. I mean, I don't know if anyone has really assessed, how big of a problem we have here today. But, if you look at the margin erosion that's going on our industry as data grows, I think it's going to be quite problematic in a couple of years. And I think you'll start seeing that in the economic performance in the industry. Even looking at Europe, for example, I mean, Europe has had so much competition around mobility that the industry has pretty much given up and said, hey, just regulate us because we can't get our cost structures down and our prices are going too down that our margin erosion is just hurting the businesses too much. So quite frankly, they pretty much gave up. In the United States, where we don't have as much competition around wireless and wireline data, quite frankly, we don't really have enough competition. We're seeing prices increase. So, it's going to be a problem. Today it may not be as evident to everybody, but in the next couple of years, this is going to become, I think, very evident. That the prices will keep going up and the technology won't be there to support this. And I think at that point, you'll start to see some drastic measures by carriers, and I think you'll start to see some very innovative, technologies pop up to solve some of these problems. And
do you actually, if I can ask a question, so do you think then that if we do not aggressively rethink how we're doing things, if the carriers and the other members of the industry do not rethink things, that all of a sudden the FCC is going to step in even more? Are we going to then become an increasingly regulated marketplace? Are even greater monopolies going to exist as a result, or is there going to be more eating up of one another's companies? What do you see happening if we don't make a change?
Yeah, so let's talk about what's happened so far, right? We had huge mobile growth in our industry for many, many years, right? And then we went through this commoditization, kind of everybody, had a mobile phone. Now we're going through the consolidation realm where all these companies are consolidating. And then they're continuing to consolidate. I mean, look at SoftBank with Sprint, and then Dish with Clearwire and LightSquared. It's all being consolidated, and that leads to lack of competition. But I think at some point, as the prices keep getting increased on the end consumer, there's going to be one of two things happen. One is consumers are going to revolt, and they're going to support a very innovative carrier that comes into the space that can offer all-you-can-eat mobile broadband, whether it's on Wi-Fi or on managed spectrum solutions, and there's going to be a disruptor. and that disruptor will force the hand of the tier one behavior of the tier ones in order to really change the way they go after this market. The other side of it is if they keep increasing prices, if they don't increase prices because they're just getting into price wars amongst themselves, I think you'll start to see margin erosion, and I think you'll start to see that the financial performance of the industry will take a big hit, and therefore, we'll have to someone will have to step in and help them manage their businesses at some point.
So Lemco has an interesting innovation which I think it sounds like, can help the carriers both restructure how they're doing and delivering, but also rethink their own business model. So can you tell us a little bit about what Lemco's doing?
Yeah, I'd be more than happy to. And as a consultant to the industry for the past 23 years, I've always tried to find where the technology problem exists or the technology opportunity exists in the industry, but also with a tremendous economic benefit. So I've been kind of, always focused on and trained to try to find that opportunity. Where is the cost? What part of the industry is driving the majority of the costs? And are there technologies out there to innovate that and have an economic benefit as a result? And that's why recently, I joined the Lemco team here, and I think Lemco's got an amazing technology set to specifically address this problem on lowering the cost per gigabit for data service significantly. And what they've done is a very simple kind of perspective on how to drive innovation into the mobile network. They've really done three things, quite frankly. The first thing they've done is, when I mentioned before, you have the cell tower here, and then you have the internet. And what's connected in between these two is a very proprietary network today. What Lemco has done is focused on the technology set from the cell site to the internet. And they've re-engineered that part of the network into software. And that's called network function virtualization. If you Google it, you can see NFV everywhere in the industry. But what Lemco has done is virtualize that whole series of technologies. There's a long list of proprietary technologies that are there, and I won't bore everybody with the details, but P gateway, S gateway, MME, the GGSN, SGSN types of functionalities. In addition to virtualizing the technologies there, Lemco has taken it one step further, and they've distributed that technology and put it all the way down at the cell tower itself. So when you take all of that complex technology and integrate it with a radio at the edge of the network, all you have to do is plug in an internet connection into your cell site, and you have a cell tower and a fully functioning mobile network right there. And you don't have to have all those proprietary backhaul network technologies that I'm sure everyone's heard of, wireless backhaul, and that's driving up the cost of the industry. But you also don't need all these proprietary technologies that have been put in place that have their own hardware stacks underneath them. So when you do simple things like virtualize the network, distribute it at the edge, and then have self-organizing, moving kind of capabilities where all the signaling is offloaded at the edge of the network, all local calls stay local, and all the backhaul is just an internet connection, so there's really no backhaul at all. You can take the cost structures and significantly invert them, and I believe technologies like this will be the major driving, influencing factor to change the economic challenges that a lot of the carriers are facing today. Because it's not about a CapEx investment to build out these technologies, it's all about lowering the OpEx associated with carrying a cost of a gigabit of data.
So I'm sorry, I'm just looking and I'm seeing that, there we go, we lost your feed for a second. So the question I then have is, you are talking about the elimination of backhaul, but isn't it because all this infrastructure actually exists that the virtualization is as powerful and effective as you describe it to be? Or what am I not understanding about what you said?
Well, I think, so let me take a little bit of a different spin on it. What Lemco is doing is they're making mobility a consumerizable solution, almost like an IT solution. Think about it this way. With Lemco's technology, a CIO of a company can walk into Best Buy and buy a LTE cell site in a box. It looks just like a Wi-Fi access point. They can take it, they can bring it back to their home or their office, and they can plug it into their normal internet connection, right? Their LAN, their enterprise LAN. And what that does is it'll automatically become an LTE cell site managed spectrum by a carrier. And the technology exists today. There's software out there today. The IT technologies exist to be able to make managed spectrum solutions as easy to purchase, which is relatively inexpensive, and then to easily deploy and manage as a Wi-Fi box. And what Lemco's done is they've enabled that, so that anybody can, purchase and deploy and manage managed spectrum solutions.
Okay.
So that's an easier way of explaining it. And now behind that, what they've done is they virtualized the whole mobile packet core and distributed it to the edge of the network and enabled swarming, self-organizing, kind of network technologies that could work on any heterogeneous network radio form factor, from a macro site to a mini, metro, micro cell site, all the way to a vehicle cell site, to a man-portable cell site, right? So I hope that helps a little bit better.
Yes, no, that did, and that made my imagination then go. So when you're saying also taking it to the edge, it's taking it to the edge not only necessarily to the tower site, but as you said, it's taking it to the edge in the home, it's taking it to the edge, and that edge could be the vehicle, a car. Am I understanding that correctly?
That's absolutely right. When you re-engineer mobility as software that could then work with any radio form factor, you're making mobility simple to use and deploy, and you could take it anywhere. So when you have an innovative technology like this, going back to our point on why are the carriers not rolling out LTE in rural areas or in the building, a technology like this will help them monetize the spectrum that they haven't been able to monetize before.
Right. Not only that, I would think that their distribution costs would completely be changed, because now it's the consumer that's actually putting out the network for them.
That's right.
Through the different applications, through different devices that they're actually using. So there was completely change everything. I buy a car, all of a sudden I've just created an LTE cell site that is mobile, and as you said, it's reconfigurable all the time.
Well, now you got it. Now you absolutely got it. So what does that enable? It enables peer-to-peer mobile communications, where the cell sites or the vehicles communicate to one another. And as they move around, they're building their own network, right? And that's the future of our industry. The future of our industry is not to keep doing things the way we've been doing them in a hub-and-spoke, centralized, monolithic form of computing. This is taking an advantage of distributed computing, which works today very well. We're just taking that distributed computing analogy or paradigm to mobility.
Brilliant. So I think this has incredible implications for M2M, clearly, because everything is about that mobility. It's about needing both the capacity for the data distribution, but also the ability for these multiple devices to speak to one another. And as we're looking at more consumer-based applications, which the past couple of shows have actually started to talk about, then we're looking at what's going to happen in e-health. You have these devices that people are going to want to use to monitor their own health, to monitor the health of a loved one, different sensors. The sensors can possibly have this software capability. Am I extrapolating properly about this?
That's absolutely correct, Limor. There's, when you have mobile broadband available everywhere in the fashion that we've discussed, think about all the enabling applications that you could support on top of that. It makes things that were very difficult to do in the past much easier. When you think about sensors distributed to protect borders, when you think about some of the agricultural or mining needs that are very M2M, dependent, but there's the challenge has always been is how do you provide network coverage in those difficult areas to get to. When you consumerize mobility like this, all those things turn on. They all become so much easier and so much more cost effective to deploy. So in essence, what you're doing is you're changing the business case for everybody that's trying to roll out M2M applications or to drive innovation, and the only thing they've needed is a low-cost, broadband network. So what we're trying to provide is that framework to be the operating system of mobility to drive that low-cost, network that can enable all these applications at a much lower cost, perspective.
Absolutely. I think this is so exciting. I think it's really wonderful because I can see all these different applications that can be going on. And in fact, you had mentioned earlier that there were possibly a couple, I don't know, maybe you can't mention the companies, but you just alluded to them a little bit, but maybe you could describe an example in just a little bit more detail. Some of the companies that are in fact using your technology from an M2M perspective very specifically to bring that connectivity which will allow them to really connect and deliver for themselves and their consumer what their offering is. Can you talk a little bit about the mining one or the agricultural example just a little bit more?
Yeah, I'll talk about it a little bit more. There's and we're getting as a very as a mature kind of startup and a an innovative technology provider, we're sure getting a lot of requests that that no one's been able to really do in the past. And some of those, are very, technically challenging and economically challenging because it's in, very difficult geographies or, under certain different, parameters that just makes it technically difficult to get mobile networks in those areas. Mining, for example, right? So if I look at the mining example and the work that we're doing is, there's certain mines that need to have LTE coverage in them to support LTE multicast. So this is video streaming in a mine, because the way that the mining technologies or vehicles in there are paid is they are paid on their productivity. So if there's ever any downtime, they're not monetizing any of that vehicle or equipment there. So that the mining industry will use our technology to provide a LTE multicast environment to make sure that everyone can see the productivity of the machines and can make sure that the machines are working correctly and people don't have to be down there, and it just automates the whole thing for them. And we've been getting a lot of requests like that. We've also been getting a lot of requests on some of the first responders emergency response networks where you can bring your own network into a national or natural disaster. We're also getting a lot of requests for border patrol kind of initiatives where you may want to have a cell site in a vehicle that's driving around and then picking up all the sensor data versus having to build your own coverage network in that area. Yeah, we're getting a lot of requests like that. It's very exciting to be from coming from some very large companies. It's very exciting to be in a very innovative, technology company like this that's trying to really, solve a significant problem in our industry like this.
And Norman, I think I really like the words used earlier of the consumerization of mobility, or I would also add the consumerization of the building of mobile networks. I think that's sort of a key element that also speaks to where we are as a public, as a society today, where we are putting the power in the hands of the consumer, and they are all of a sudden building and creating all kinds of things that we would never have thought of. So if you actually give them the platform, if you give them the ability to create and produce, they will build your industry for you, show you things that they want, and they will actually just do it for you, and all of a sudden you can just reap the benefits. And of course there are certain costs involved, but you can reap the benefits and reap the revenue benefits as a result. And I see that possibly happening for us here in the M2M industry with solutions such as Lemco's that are being brought and put into the hands of the consumer. What do you think? Am I understanding this correctly?
I think you've got it. It's look at the consumers drive the wireless industry already, right? And it's very device driven and very consumer driven. And quite frankly, in my past roles, I've seen some consumer studies where consumers, quite frankly, don't like their relationship with a carrier. it's at the bottom, and then the bank is right above it because of all the banking charges. So
where's the dentist? The question is, where's the dentist in that?
Yeah, not far above that, right? So, but the relationship that the consumer has with the wireless carrier today is not positive at all, and the consumers are driving the data consumption. They're driving the devices that they want to use, and why not have them drive where they want network coverage, right? So. And they are doing this in Wi-Fi today. You're starting to see Wi-Fi networks pop up, and some innovative companies are trying to do like communications and sharing across Wi-Fi networks that have popped up. But Wi-Fi, is a unlicensed, contention-based, technology that's really not going to scale the way that the industry is going to need it to scale. So why not consumerize managed spectrum solutions, put it on a piece of hardware that can be easily consumed, and let consumers, buy it, put it wherever they want, connect it to the internet, and the carriers will still monetize that, right? But at least it'll provide a network that won't go down whenever there's a hurricane or something that comes by.
Wonderful. Norman, you've just described an alternative future for us that I think is very exciting, and I wish Lemco a great deal of success, because I think its offering is something that could really turn some heads and turn some business models around and give us a lot of opportunity in terms of what can be built into the future. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity, and look forward to talking to you again. Thank you.
Absolutely. And before you go, though, I want to be sure that everyone can find you if they want to speak to Lemco further. So how can they be in contact?
Well, I would suggest just go to our website. It's www.lemco.com, and there's a contact button there. And otherwise, hit me up on Google Plus or on LinkedIn, and I'll be more than happy to respond very quickly. So that's probably the best way. Thank you.
Wonderful, Norman. Thank you so much for being with us.
You bet. Thank you.
So thank you all for joining us. And actually, before you go, I wanted to talk a little bit to you, again, a little bit of the Future Think Market moment, where I take a look at the future and what another industry might be that we should be taking a look at. And I'm going to build right off of what our conversation with Norman was about, because I really do think his technology, or what Lemco is offering, really allows people to put into their own hands what it is they want to build. So imagine, I don't know if you remember, but go back to the day where you were in grade school, middle school, and you had to do either home ec, oh my God, or you had to go to a wood shop or something like that, and you were cutting and pasting. And wasn't it fun, though, to cut and paste and put things together with your hands and stuff? So people are doing that more and more today. And that is something that is becoming the makers marketplace. So you may have heard of makers out there. It's a whole industry that is starting to boom and explode. And the makers are starting to combine things, because not only are they working with their hands and cutting and pasting, all this kind of stuff, but they're also taking that digital evolution of content creation that was happening from consumers, i.e. it started off being with blogging and then video blogging, and then starting with your own audio channels and radio channels and TV channels on YouTube, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And now it's starting to combine everything with 3D printing. So now we're taking that digital world of creation, content creation, we're combining it with that formerly analog world of content creation. We're bringing it together so that people are able to come up with their own designs and print things and make things of their own. Because what's happening, consumers are no longer just consumers, they're becoming producers. And the question for us here in the M2M world is, how can we take advantage of that? What tools, what platforms can we put into the hands of the consumer so that they can create the products they want and make use of our technology, feed us revenue, lower our distribution and manufacturing costs and retail costs by putting it and taking care of it on their own, and also feeding a natural desire which we are seeing evolving in our society today? This is the question that I'm posing to you, the M2M industry, because I think there's a great deal of possibilities there. So if we take a look, for example, at 3D printing, and we take what is being printed here today. You know, you can print anything from nice little jewelry. You can print links to create a handbag of your own. You can create, you can print a gun. You can print skin tissue. You can print, and actually I was just reading about it today. Today there are these super micro lithium batteries that can be printed, and they're smaller than the width of the size of a single hair. Now, if you think about these capabilities, and this is being put, if you have the right materials, these are put into the hands of the consumer. Imagine what they can put together. Imagine what they can do. Imagine what you can do. So as we're looking at that future, I'm challenging you, the M2M industry, to think differently about, or enhance, not to think differently, but maybe to enhance what you're thinking about when you're talking about your own technology, your own products. What are the applications that you want to use? What are the things that the consumers can want and can do in e-health, in marketing, et cetera, to put them in a position where they can create their own product? So that's my question to you. And while you're contemplating it, I wanted to introduce you to a little video which I found, which I absolutely love. This is something I actually saw at a maker's workshop school class that was being given in New York City at NYU, and this person is making use of it. It's great. It's called Makey Makey. It's a USB circuit board with 18 key press connections and one ground connection. And with these 18 key press connections, you hook them up with these wires to something. And when you touch that thing, it can create, because those wires are connected to a laptop, it can create a sound. And you can put different sound files to these different things. So for the fun of it, I'm going to show you this video, and we're going to take a look right now at this. There we go, and I'm going to play it for you, and I think you're going to enjoy it. This man is using Makey Makey to play the Star Spangled Banner. Video is just slowing down a little bit. Have patience. It'll come back in a moment. Basically, you can see the wires are connected, the Makey Makey wires are connected to each food device, and he's playing each food device. Just a little example. Okay, now he's ready. I'll go over further. Oh no, which tone? Oh no. So as you can see, you can be really creative with what you're doing. And here is a simple, simple device that there are all these videos on YouTube, if you want to put in Makey Makey, to show you how people are creatively using something so simple as little connections with sound audio files that are bringing digital together with the real world, and people doing all kinds of really creative things. It's just a small example of what I'm talking about, but I think if we start extrapolating, if we start thinking about what we've heard about thus far, both from Lemco as well as Gemalto with its open source application that it has, that is bringing M2M and putting in the hands, ready hands of app developers. If we look at just also what Reka Wireless is doing in terms of offering that infrastructure, that understanding that it can offer to companies and to people who want to develop new kinds of applications for all kinds of realms. The industries are infinite in terms of where M2M can grow. The kinds of companies that are in the M2M space are so creative. We can really do some really interesting things. So I invite you to continue with this future think. of this market moment here at U2U Connect. Thank you so much for joining us today. Have a great rest of the day, and until next time, I hope you will keep on thinking about what the future can bring. Talk to you soon.